Okay, with this question, we probably sense some trouble, right? We see that every choice has punctuation marks that we're not very familiar with, that we don't use very often in our own writing. So this is a good example where we need to make sure we've got the SAT rules about these punctuation marks memorized. We're not going to be able to just hear the best answer here. The punctuation just messes that up too much. So there are two rules that we need to know. First and foremost, the rule for the semicolon is basically the easier rule. We need to have a complete sentence before the semicolon and a complete sentence after it. Basically, a semicolon for SAT purposes is a period. Functions the same way. So that's an easy test that we can apply. The rule for the colon is similar, but it's not as strict. So with the colon, we do need to have a complete sentence before the colon, but afterwards we have some flexibility. We could have a sentence, that's possible. We could have a list, that's what we normally associate with colons, but we could also just have one word. We have a lot of flexibility afterwards, so we'll get to that. But let's start with the easier one. Complete sentences before and after for the semicolon. So that means we got to look at choice A to start. But Jason Box, an associate professor of geology at Ohio State, believes that another factor added to the early thaw. That's a sentence, right? Now, I could cut that down even further, and we did this for the previous question where we had to worry about number 15 there, but the main sentence is just this part. So that piece that's underlined is basically kind of like an extra clause, and so we can kind of skip over it to help us understand where the main sentence actually is. So I'll keep reading that just to cut it shorter. But Jason Box believes that another factor added to the early thaw. I could put a period right there. That's a complete sentence. But then look at what comes after. The dark snow problem. That's not a sentence. There's no verb. There's no action. They don't say anything about the dark snow problem. They just say it. And so for that reason, this is not a complete sentence. We can't use a semicolon here because it needs to have a complete sentence on both sides. So that goes away. And B gets closer. It does kind of add in a verb with the word was. And it was the dark snow problem. The issue here is just the weirdness of it. Like, I don't know, maybe this is kind of like grammatically correct in a way because it is a sentence, but and is a word that we use to connect two sentences, and a semicolon is a punctuation mark that we use to connect two sentences. So both of them are kind of doing the same job, so there's no need for both of them. That would be really weird. And so I'm not really sure if that makes it grammatically correct or not, but it's too weird. We're almost being redundant with this choice. Even if we're being grammatically correct, there's just a weird redundancy of two tools that we would use to connect sentences are being used, and we only need one of them. So the semicolon fails. And I will say that generally speaking, semicolons are very rarely correct in the SAT. There's just usually something better. But you know, if it passes the test, it could work. So here, this is not good enough. So another thing that I notice with practice is word choices that include the word being tend to be wrong. It's a word that kind of just adds nothing or confuses a sentence, messes with the style. And so it's kind of doing that here. Being the dark snow problem, it's just that word doesn't really help us in any way. We can get away without it. And the reason is that even though the second part there after the colon isn't a sentence, it's still functioning in a good way for what a colon is supposed to do. The way it works is the part after the colon, let's change that up, the part after the colon is supposed to answer or explain a question that's implied by the first part. So let me read the first part again. But Jason Box believes that another factor added to the early thaw. What was that factor? The dark snow problem. That's how a colon works. There's no literal question there, but it's heavily implied, and the colon is really telling me we're going to answer that question right now. So that's a good thing to know. The SAT loves to use colons in that way. Yes, we associate colons with lists, and it's kind of related to the same thing, is that the list is somehow an answer or an explanation of a question that's kind of raised. So get that in your head. That's a more advanced way to look at the colon. It's really helpful for the SAT. It's really good for your own writing. I use colons in that way all the time. I think it enhances your writing. But the key for this particular question is we really need to know the rules for these two things. And the rules are much more about like strict grammatical things. What makes a sentence and what doesn't. And those rules, because they're so concrete, help us get this difficult question right, because it stops being about our opinion and it starts really just being about like the facts are the facts, the rules are the rules. This has to be the answer, even if you yourself would never have written these ideas in this way, because these are advanced punctuation marks that you probably don't feel confident with. Hopefully that helped. Make sure you memorize those rules. We're going to see them come up on other questions, but they are absolutely the first thing that should come to mind for you whenever a question involves a semicolon or a colon.